my lovely fire hopefully won't burn out and I can stay warm for another session. We've got my good friends from Kwalee, and we all know each other very well, including you and Jake. You know each other as well.
Long-time judges for the big indie pitch.
See you both tomorrow as well.
Yeah, see you there.
I'll leave you to it.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you don't know what we're talking about, we were obviously joined by Jake from Kwalee and Mark, one of the developers who work with Kwalee, and I'll let Mark introduce himself in a minute, but just to let you all know what we're talking about, so you're in the loop. Kwalee are one of our season sponsors for the Big Indie Pitch, and have been supporting us for a long time here, not just through the digital but before. So Kwalee will be joining us again tomorrow for the Big Indie Pitch, and for any of you who might be pitching tomorrow, I'm sure there'll be a lot of tidbits to take away within this talk. But apart from that, there might be a lot of people who, I'm sure they know Kwalee, but they might not know you specifically, Jake. But why don't you give us a brief introduction of yourself and a little bit for Kwalee?
So I am a senior publishing manager at Kwalee, and we work on hyper-casual mobile games. We're a publisher and an internal development studio. So we're working with developers like Spunge Games to find hit games, test games that have strong potential in the hyper-casual space. And I think one of the things that always excites me about hyper-casual is that it's kind of genre spanning. It's these games that kind of fill the time that you've got free, like where you've got a few minutes, you can kind of pick something up and quickly play it and then put it down and come back to it later. So yeah, my role is essentially working with developers, coaching developers, and kind of liaising with internal teams and development teams to take games from test to global launch.
Yeah. And one of those people is Mark. Now, I'd like to, first of all, I think this shows the international nature of the show as well. Is Jake, you're obviously here in the UK, like I am, but Mark, you're all the way over in Australia, aren't you?
Yes, Queensland, Brisbane. So
fantastic.
It's 8:30 at night here.
It's not as bad as the original time slot, so that's good. So I'm glad it's still a reasonable time for you. But yeah, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, for those of you who might not know who you and your studio are.
Sure. So Spunge Games is a relatively small independent studio based in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. 15. We range between sort of 14 and 18 staff, depending on where we are at the moment. We also spun out of a rather large animation studio. So we have a sister company that does animations for Disney and Nickelodeon and companies like that. So we get a lot of our content. We're lucky, our 15 people, we don't include concept art, and a lot of our animation stuff gets done outside. So we're probably a little bit bigger than 15. Started in 2014. Lucky enough to have a couple of worldwide big hits in the Fairly Breaks and Fairly Rider in 2016, back before the hyper-casual kind of boom, so to speak. So we started to transition away from self-publishing and away from that traditional sort of all organic users into a user acquisition driven business in about 2018, middle 2018. And then probably as we started to do that and hyper-casual became a bigger thing, we started to reach out and work with publishers sort of late 2019. So we've got 3 games that are out there now in different iterations in the hyper-casual and publishing space, and then we've got 7 games that we've developed and self-published. And we've had about 80 million downloads across those games. So we're sort of in that mid-tier success range. Haven't quite become iconic, but we're doing better.
You're getting there.
Yeah, we're not exactly struggling, but we're not far off.
It's absolutely lovely to have you here, and obviously the title of this is well, specifically it's how we transition from successful casual games developer to hyper casual. And so I suppose let's start with the clear one. And I suppose if we start with you, Jake, and then we can move on to you, Mark, and we can, like I did in the last one, we can keep reversing the order, or you guys can just chip in when you have some input on it. But what would you say are the main differences you found when switching from that casual market to this ever-growing hyper-casual market? I suppose the hyper-casual market is in the scheme of games is fairly new, although it's not brand new. And so, you know, what would you say has been the main differences when transitioning through, Jake?
So I think my understanding of casual games is going to be a lot less than Mark's. And I think like one of the biggest things is the change in development cycles. Like hypercasual allows you to work quite quickly on a concept, an idea that you've got, and build that out to something that's testable, and then verify whether that has some market potential. Like this is why CTR tests and CPI tests are things that hypercasual publishers are always focused on, because they allow you to kind of validate that concept before investing too much resource in kind of pushing ahead with it.
Yeah, and Mark?
Yeah, I think the big sort of difference to me with the casual and I don't know that hyper casual is kind of a buzzword. I think that it's still casual gaming, but I think what sort of changed with it is that the notion of it's broad appeal, it's mass market. I think back in 2016 when we were doing our games, we were trying to find a niche, trying to find a little group that might like our game, and then our challenge was discoverability and the like. And you know, back in those days, we were quite lucky that we got a lot of support from the platform holders in Apple and Google, and we were able to get a lot of free users. But on a scale that was relatively small, even though it was millions and tens of millions of users, small in comparison to hyper casual. So what we've kind of had to change in our thinking is how do we make these games with as broad an appeal and accessibility as we can. And that was a big challenge for us, because we came out of we were kind of inspired by Flappy Bird and games like that back in the day, which were frustration games. So we made a lot of our games in our early spaces, certainly Fairly Breaks was a game that was built on crashing and dying and difficulty and hard to master. And hyper casual is almost the opposite of that. It's more tranquil. It's more, you know, just a bit more, you know, time-consuming kind of game rather than that traditional challenging game. So that's been the big thing for us, is how do we make a game that has a broader appeal so we can chase bigger markets.
Yeah. And like hypercasual has definitely transitioned from that kind of Flappy Bird era of games where it was frustrating, it was challenging, it was like keep hammering away at it and do better than you did last time, to something that allows you to feel a lot of satisfaction as a player and feel those kind of moments of joy and those little smiles, as opposed to something where you're kind of hammering away at it to try and get better and better every time.
Yeah, I mean, and so, you know, addressing Flappy Bird, that obviously was a one-person developed thing, and a lot of these experiences, especially in the mobile space, start from small beginnings in terms of new trends. But you know, now hyper casual is massive. You know, it's such a massive market. And what would you say are the benefits of having a development team, you know, within a studio that's working on hyper casual development, however we, you know, define it internally, but as a longer term project rather than something to just capitalize on in the here and now? You know, Mark's probably in a great position to give some insight on that first. I mean, would you say that's important?
Yeah, I think it's something that as a studio we're still trying to come to terms with. There's certainly differences in cultural approach to making games to what we were doing in 2016 to what we're doing in 2020. I think there can be a bit of a trap with hyper casual to treat them and think of the games as disposable. So, you know, how many quick little tests can I do? How quickly can I do them? I need to do 100 in order to get a good game. So let's just get in there and smash them out, and hopefully we'll pick up that piece of gold. We'll stub our toe on something and we'll pick it up and it'll be worth money. If you take that approach, it's hard to have a long-term vision for what the studio is going to do. You're almost sort of putting all your eggs in this basket, hoping you get lucky, and away you go. So our approach is we build a lot of mechanics. And I think in talking to Jake and talking to Kwalee, that's what we talk to the publisher about a lot, is what's a little mechanic that might be fun that we can explore on. And then we might try and take that mechanic and apply it to 5 or 6 different games, 2 or 3 which may be hyper casual, another one which may fall back into our self-publishing in our own Fairly sort of franchise. And trying to, I mean, at the end of the day, it's learning. You've got to set this up in a way that you fail fast, fail quick, and all those buzzwords that we hear about hyper casual. It's very true, but you can't fail without learning.
Yeah.
So you've got to take a longer approach. Like, what can we do with this? And like when we talk to Kwalee now, quite often our discussions will go back to a mechanic that we made in 2017 that we think, hey, we did this. What do you think of this little video? And Kwalee will say, hey, I think we can find something there. So we're always going back and looking at the catalog. We don't treat it as a disposable, even though we are every day trying to become more efficient in testing quicker, failing faster, moving on, finding the right thing. It's never done in a disposable way.
Yeah, and Jake, you work with a range of developers, an awful lot of them. I mean, how important is it that they, understand the long-term approach to this development?
I think like there's always a commitment with Hypercasual, because you're not necessarily going to just stumble across one game that's going to be a hit straight away. It's not necessarily going to be the first game that you make that is a hit. In fact, when we started talking, Mark, we were talking about another game that we tested that didn't work out. And we gave it a few tries, tried a few different iterations of it, and then decided to move on to Sharpshooter. And it's exactly that. Like, you shouldn't kind of approach it assuming that it's going to work straight away, but every project that you work on is a learning experience, and it kind of works both ways. When you're working on casual and hyper casual games, you can take things that you've built into a hyper casual prototype and kind of use that to build up something a bit more in depth and a bit more involved as a casual game, and vice versa. You'll have something that is in a casual game that you can apply to a hyper casual game and strip away some of the other areas of that game that work as just a mechanic that engages and can market effectively on its own.
Yeah, I mean, and I know I said we were going to switch and swap, but I want to come back to Mark for the next question first, because I think it's important to address it in that order. But Mark, how important has it been? You addressed this, kind of touched on it right at the start about how you were self-publishing and then you've moved to working with a publisher, especially as you've made more what we consider hyper-casual experiences now. How important is a publisher when transitioning into the hyper-casual development for the first time? How important has Kwalee been as a partner to you guys?
I think the publisher is crucial to the process. I mean, gaming, you develop games and then you've got to have discoverability in order to find a market. There's got to be a way for the audience to become aware of what you're doing. And, as I said, in our previous life, we were getting that discoverability through the platform holders and the activities that they do. That sort of market's not as strong as it used to be. So now we need to find other ways to do that. And in a lot of ways, that comes down to potentially spending a lot of money. The money can be low risk, and that's what this is all about, but it's still spending a lot of money and being able to manage and test and iterate and all that sort of stuff. And that's where the partnership comes from. Speaking to Jake earlier today, just reminiscing about this, when we first looked to do this, and we continue to do user activity and stuff ourselves on the games that we've published previously. But when I sat down and looked at this, to do it on a scale that we wanted to do it at, and a scale of what Fairly Breaks in our previous games have been, just sitting down and working out how to establish a team to do that, you're talking about probably 7 figures to make that happen. And that's to just have it. That doesn't make it good. It doesn't mean it's going to work. It's just setting up the infrastructure. So why, as you're starting out, or why when you're getting into this, would you take on those sort of tasks is a little bit for me. But just one other thing I just wanted to quickly cover, like Jake sort of said, we started talking about another game, and just to correct Jake, we haven't quite given up on that game being
we are still.
But more importantly, it's a game we're going to self-publish if it doesn't. And the iteration and the learning and the stuff that we've done with Kwalee, while it hasn't got us to the scale where a partnership between Spunge and Kwalee might make sense, we have got that game working to a point where it will make sense for us to do it ourselves on a smaller scale. And I think that's going back to the last question of how important to have this hyper-casual thing in there, because that's what our other games don't have, is that underlying build that we're doing now in partnership with Kwalee to set up a game that can be successful on a different types of scale. It doesn't have to be a multi-million download hit. We can get by with it being a nice complement to the other stuff we're doing. And we wouldn't have got there with that game without working with Kwalee and working on the hyper-casual space.
Yeah, exactly. And Jake, I suppose, to try and reword the question so it's not just, you know, a self-congratulatory question, you know, it's like, what would you say to, you know, to a developer who's sort of on the fence about working with with or without a publisher in the hyper-casual space? You know, what would you say that Kwalee like are offering to developers that maybe Mark hasn't touched on, you know, to help bring that idea to the next level?
So I think there's already an infrastructure in place to kind of test concepts and work with a design team, work with a marketing team to make the most of the concept that you've got and the prototype that you're making. And there's a huge like pool of knowledge and experience that me as a publishing manager, I can dig into from our development team, our design team, our marketing team. I can liaise with all of those and draw that information and kind of use all of their knowledge essentially to help support a developer where, as a developer going into it without a publisher, I feel like it would be a challenge to kind of set all of that stuff up yourself and kind of build out that knowledge for yourself. You can kind of get a lot from a publisher in terms of working directly, and like Mark and I have regular calls where we'll just talk through ideas and talk through things that we've seen working recently and looking at ads and analyzing ads to understand how these games are performing. So I think one of the biggest benefits of working with a publisher is that knowledge base that you've got, as well as the infrastructure that isn't necessarily feasible to set up for a smaller team.
Yeah, I mean, and so sticking with that idea, and especially of you know, both in general, but also specifically to the topic at hand of when transitioning a game from, you know, maybe a casual into a hyper casual experience, you know, how involved are the in-house team, you know, your in-house designers at Kwalee, you know, and how does this work when adapting a game to hyper casual? You know, like, is it a hands-off approach? Is it a very hands-on approach, or is it bespoke? You know, how does it work?
It's pretty bespoke. So it depends on the game itself and the studio itself. Like, we're quite lucky with Spunge that you guys have got a lot of game design expertise and experience, and there's a real passion there for hyper casual games, and a lot of knowledge that you guys are bringing to the table as well that we kind of collaborate on. I think there's always a collaborative approach between the design and marketing teams from the publisher with the teams from the developer. I think the best results always come from that collaboration, as opposed to kind of these teams working in silos essentially and pushing towards the same goal but from different angles.
Yeah, and Mark, has that been an important process for you in working with the publisher, that collaboration on the design elements? Obviously, as Jake says, you've got a lot of, you know, very well experienced, you know, developers, so you're probably on the side that, you know, maybe needs less help, but how important is it nonetheless?
I don't know about less help. I think you know, there's a long-standing adage in gaming, and you know, the guys who develop the games are the worst people to be critiquing the game. You understand it, you get it, you built it because you can see the vision of what it's going to be, and without the iteration and the partnerships and all this sort of stuff, you know, and we've been there. Believe me, our first 2 or 3 games were unbelievably unsuccessful. And you know, it's not till the day you put it out that you realise that, hey, no one likes this. Because we didn't put it out because we didn't like it. We put it out because we thought it was great. So collaboration is really important. And you know, even in the last conversation that you guys were just having, talking about that play testing and setting up groups and getting that outside stuff is vitally important. And having people like Kwalee and publishers there to bring their access to data, their experience. You know, these guys, like, you know, we've made, and you know, we're a relatively successful developer. We've got 7 games. I mean, these guys probably do 7 games a month. Just the experience that brings to pass on to that stuff is really important. And I think the other side of it is, you know, game making is becoming more and more like you see people talking to singers and songwriters. This overnight success stuff is nonsense. You know, you have to iterate through 5 or 6 games before you have a successful one. And then the great misnomer you get with students and people fresh into this is, once the game's out and number 1, it's all over, you just sit back and count the money. Well, you know, you've got 2 years of supporting this game and constant iteration. And probably the thing we've learned really heavily in the last 12 months is, if you're not working on testing, changing, adapting your game every day, your game's going backwards. Failure Breaks is 5 years old now, and we're still A/B testing it every week, looking for ways to maintain it earning money and maintain it of interest, and how do we maximize its performances and all this sort of stuff. So again, doing that on a big scale and doing that without a partner, it will be very challenging.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to ask one more quick question before we get to the Q&A, because we've got a number of questions coming in. But I suppose it addresses one of the things that I just think is really important, because obviously, especially working with independent developers, as I do, you see a lot of people getting down when something doesn't work or doesn't take. I mean, and obviously, Mark, you just addressed then about testing, different iterations of a game. And at the start of our talk, you said about, you can't be afraid to fail. That's part of the learning process. I mean, how important, especially when transitioning a game, or at least in your case, trying to take it to the next level, how important is that constant testing, iterating, and that notion of not being afraid to make a mistake as long as you understand to correct it later on? How important is all of that?
It's massive. And you can't be afraid of making mistakes, because I'll guarantee you'll be wrong 9 out of 10 times in terms of the actual thing you're testing. You'll never, ever get it right. What you'll get is varying degrees of success. I mean, most testing we do really just brings another question. You don't solve, there's no, I was saying to Jake before, we're talking about this, and I sort of said, if there was an answer here, I'd have found it and I'd be living in the Bahamas. There's no answer. There is just constant iteration, constant going around in circles. And sometimes, I mean, I talk to my team that does our A/B testing and our user performance today. And we've just spent a month doing this testing, and we're basically back exactly where we started at the end of the month and at the beginning of the month. And I just said to the team, guys, we're going to take this as a win, because we didn't go backwards. We are actually better off than we were at the month, but maybe it doesn't justify the work we put in. But in some ways, if we weren't doing that, we wouldn't have moved forward. And again, that's where a good publisher that's not treating your games as disposable, that is working towards you, is helping you learn. That's one of the things I like about Kwalee. Even when we've got games that may not be successful, we're still talking about how can we use that mechanic. Hey, maybe if we tried that over here, look at this game might work with that. Let's think about how we can iterate and keep moving, keep learning, and keep testing, because you will not just sit down, come up with an idea and have that game become a multi-million-dollar hit. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and Jake, in your case, I mean, I know this just from the pitch and all of our talks that we have afterwards in the judging. You guys might, obviously, as we see, you've worked with Mark on loads of different games and testing and evolving, but you also might find a game that you think, is, let's say, is what we would define as casual, but you've maybe got that thing and it can be adapted, or it can be taken into the hyper casual stage. I mean, how important is testing on the Kwalee process level? I mean, I know we've addressed it slightly in terms of how much you alluded to iterating with Mark, but I think to address the question directly.
Yeah, so in terms of testing games, it's essential. It's the best way and really the only way to understand the potential of a game and a mechanic, and how engaging that is for a wider audience. Like, you're testing these things to understand whether they're scalable, whether you're able to push that game and get it in front of millions of users worldwide. And if it doesn't work at that stage, you can analyze why it hasn't worked and potentially understand something that could be a different spin on it, or look at it in a different way, or understand that it's not worth it, move on to the next thing. Because the more time you spend on something that doesn't necessarily work, then the more frustrating it's going to be when you get to the end and you kind of say, okay, right, it hasn't worked. Now we've spent all of that time on it. But you always gain that kind of learning from that testing process and from iterating on games and working through different prototypes and concepts.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, I mean, we've got a couple of minutes to get into some questions, and there is one question I think that's really quite good, actually, is and addresses the topic and everything else, and it's a question that many people might have. So I'm going to start with you, Jake, on this one. Here's the question is: some people think hyper casual is just a phase, others think that it's getting closer to hyper casual games with deeper core loops. What are your views on the future of the market? And I know it's a wide question, but I think it's an important one to address, even if briefly.
We're definitely seeing hyper casual games with slightly deeper core loops. I think there's a lot more content. There's more, like me and Mark were talking about this earlier on. There's more to show in these games now that is still something you can quickly pick up. It's still something that has appeal to a mass audience, and it still feels hyper casual. It still hits all of those marks, all of these core principles of hyper casual. But there's more content to it. People are looking for more. Like, I think the bar for quality in hyper casual games for players has kind of increased and increased over time. Like, we've gone from 2017, 2018, where we've got like Flappy Birds and games with like just primitive shapes where you're controlling a sphere, to games like Let's Be Cops, where you're playing as a police officer, kind of scanning cars and then choosing whether to arrest people. I think there is more depth in them, but they're still quite distinct from casual games in that they fit into these smaller time periods.
Yeah, and Mark, I think I might have an idea to your answer given to what you mentioned at the start. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're someone who sees a convergence, in these fields to an extent.
I'm a big believer in people like to label things. I think casual games are casual games, and they go through very different iterations of what they are. I think hyper casual is a result of two things, and that is the broadening of the market. More people that aren't traditional gamers coming in, using their mobile phones, smartphones in their hands. Jake and I talked about it before. I see casual games being very much across the modern day crossword puzzle. They're things that people interact with every day at certain times and become very habit forming. I think the other side of hyper casual is just that discoverability. It's a market now where it's so broad that you have to be able to spend money to acquire users. And if you're going to do that, you've got to chase broad markets. So you've got to have accessible. That's why they become simpler and easier. We're appealing to that new market and that ever growing market, but they're becoming more sophisticated. They've had the phones for longer. That the generations are growing up, so they're going to want more and more challenge out of the games that they're getting. So I think we will see this become more depth to these games, because that's what the audience wants. And it's just a matter of, over the past 2 years, we've had an immature audience in terms of the greater number of people playing mobile games haven't come from a gaming background. They've come from traditional board games and crossword puzzles and Sudoku and all that sort of stuff. And as they're experiencing more games, they're moving from those into slowly more depth, and they're trying out Clash of Clans and all the other things, and they're just becoming more demanding of what they're going to want. So the games are going to have to move with that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're nearly at time now. But I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question, which is hypercasual a good path for more unexperienced developers to get into the market? What do you think, Mark?
I think it's a lower risk in terms of you can fail a lot more quickly at a lower risk, but I do think to some extent, if you're starting out, there is a bit of a labour of love involved in a game development. I think I talk to students a lot about getting into the industry, and that used to always be about going and getting a job and working for a massive, big AAA studio, and they're all over the world. Well, they've consolidated; those jobs are sort of gone. And if you want to work in mobile and you want to work in an indie studio, it's a passion thing. So I was talking to Jake about this before. You got to find your way of dealing with hypercasual. I don't think there's a single hypercasual market out there, and all the developers are doing the same thing. But I think quick iteration, quick failure, testing your game, understanding that there's an interest out there, there is a potential market for it, is vital no matter what sort of mobile game you're making. And hypercasual is the perfect way to test all of this stuff. Even the game we spoke to Jake about testing today, we're already saying, well, if we can test it right, that comes out well, we can build a hypercasual game, but there's a VR game here, and there's a this game here, and there's a that game here. But we'd be mad to go and try and build the VR one. Let's test it and find the audience before we go that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when it comes to hypercasual being a good place for inexperienced developers, I think to an extent it is. There's a lot of kind of in-depth knowledge that's needed to make hyper-casual games work, but typically you can work with a publisher to get that kind of knowledge. I think what hyper-casual lends itself well to, as Mark said, is kind of failing fast and trying out a lot of different ideas. And you can, instead of deciding to kind of, all right, I'm going to learn game development by focusing on one massive game and learn all of these different elements of it, you can make a bunch of tiny games, a bunch of smaller games that you can test out and understand how they work. You also get a bit of an understanding of the market for games and the business side of games, which is hugely important if you're trying to build a career in game development, right?
Yeah,
And
fantastic. Sorry, Mark.
There's a very high upside, you know, if you do manage to put together a game that's good. And you know, when we set up our studio, you know, one of the things I used to say to our board and investors and stuff that put into the studio when we started it was, you know, don't worry about the projections and the figures and all that sort of stuff. You've got to believe you can make something in the top. If you can believe you can make a game that's in the top 10% of games being made, you'll do all right. And if you don't, maybe you should think about doing something else.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Thank you both. That is literally time. So I just want to say thank you to both of you for being a part of this Fireside Chat. I think there was, you know, some really interesting takeaways. Thank you, Mark, for joining us from the other side of the world. And obviously, Jake, I'll be seeing you tomorrow. So I'll look forward to that.
Looking forward to it. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you. And Martine, you'll get a break from me for an hour, in which time I promise I'll have fixed my flickering green screen as it was doing it towards the end.
Well, you know, this small issues will always be there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. See you soon.
But yeah, thank you all, and I'm sure I'll see everyone else in an hour for a panel. But yeah, thank you, Jake. Thanks, Mark.
Bye.